Great. Okay, hello everybody and welcome to Accessibility. It's more than just screen readers. My name is Stephanie Slattery. My Twitter handle is Sublime March if you feel it in your heart to live tweet me. I'm a front-end engineer and I specialize in accessibility. I've led accessibility audits and fixes for all sorts of clients, and I give talks and workshops about accessibility to lovely people like yourselves across the United States. I work for a place called Clique Studio in Chicago. We are a design and technology company. We work with ambitious teams to create industry-leading digital experiences, and our philosophy from day one has always been really simple: just build something. Our business is based on three things, and just those three things: quality, education, and people. And at Clique, we place a strong emphasis on diversity and inclusion, and that's why I'm able to speak to you today about accessibility. Let's get started. So, what is accessibility? I have a great definition for you. It's the design of products, devices, services, or environments for people who experience disabilities. And it's the practice of removing barriers that might prevent people with disabilities from accessing all of those things. Technology really shouldn't be a barrier to people. It should make people's lives even easier. I can't imagine that there are many of us that would say, I write my code to make someone's life harder, to make someone's day awful. Maybe you do that, I don't know your life, but we should be trying to make people's lives easier with the things we make. And I've found in my work with accessibility that it's easiest to understand what accessibility is and why we care about it by talking about disability first. So there are a few general categories of disability to think about when we're designing for the web or really any technology. I'm going to give you a list, but it's important to think that this is not an exhaustive list. It's just a starting point for understanding. And also, all of these disabilities could be the result of disease, trauma, or some congenital issue. So the first category of disability is probably the first one you might think of when you think accessibility, when you think designing a website to be accessible. That's visual disability. This could be complete or partial blindness, low vision, color blindness, things like that. The next is hearing. So this includes deafness, folks who are hard of hearing, things like hyperacusis, which is a sensitivity to certain frequencies and volume ranges of sound. Next is motor disability. So this includes things like paralysis, cerebral palsy, carpal tunnel syndrome, repetitive strain injury, things like dyspraxia, which affects the planning of how you coordinate your movements when you move your body in some way. In general, these can cause an inability to use a mouse, a slower response time than somebody without a disability, or limited fine motor control. So those are the motor disabilities. And the last one is cognitive disability. So these include conditions both that alter your cognition, like head injury or a developmental disability or autism, and learning disabilities like dyslexia, dyscalculia, or ADHD. A lot of the times, these can cause things like a distractibility, or an inability to remember or focus on large amounts of information. And these are categories of disability that people don't always think about when they're thinking about accessibility, but are just as important. And here's the kicker. All of these people use technology. They use the internet. Whoa, right? Whenever I give a talk like this, there's always somebody who I talk to after who is shocked that there's somebody who's paralyzed from the neck down who's using their website. They're surprised that people who are blind use their website. All of these folks use technology, and it's helped in part by assistive technology. So you heard the title of my talk. It's not just screen readers, but a major assistive tech is a screen reader. Now, these are even cooler than you might think. They don't just read the text on a website to the user. They also tell the user information about how the document of the site is structured. So say an accordion, and it opens up this page, or this is a link, and it'll go to this place. There's a ton of detail that a screen reader can give a user. It's awesome. Another kind of assistive tech is a magnifier. So this can either be hardware, like a physical magnifier you put over a screen, or a software magnifier. I'm sure I'm not the only person that has accidentally zoomed on a browser and everything's gotten huge and giant letters. It's one example of a software magnifier. Other assistive tech includes large print and tactile keyboards. So these keyboard keys will be much larger than an average keyboard key, or will have raised text or other indicators that make it easier to either see the keyboard or feel the keys so you can hit them correctly. Other assistive tech are eye gaze and head mouse systems. These are so cool. These are devices that track the way that the user's eye moves, where it's pointing, looking at a screen, and then enables the user to click and move a mouse and whatever they need to do just by moving their eyes. Awesome. Another assistive tech is one that the folks in the room, and if you're watching this recording, you can see this right now, speech recognition. Either an automated system or a person who is physically typing what's being said. You also have this, if you have most smartphones, on your phone. If you're talking to Siri, if you're talking to Google, it's recognizing your voice and interpreting that command, and that's assistive technology. This also includes closed captions, which again, we have awesome speech recognition powered closed captions that you might be using right now. And these might also just be written by a person as part of a transcript when a video is put up. Awesome. Two more examples that I have pictures for you so you can understand a bit better. This is something called a sip and puff device. This is used to send signals to a computer or other device using air pressure. And you sip, you inhale air, or you puff, exhaling air on a straw or a tube. You can see this gentleman is using that in this photo to give commands to a computer or a wheelchair. Awesome, just using air pressure. Another one is a head mouse or a head button system. So you can see there's a little sort of trigger-like button next to his head. And he's able to just move his head directly against that button in different patterns, different strengths, as a way to give commands to a computer. Awesome, right? So many different assistive technologies that people are using right now to use your website, your technology that you've created. Cool, okay, but why does this matter? So there are some people that use assistive tech. Why do we care? Well, in the United States, 1 in 5 Americans have some form of disability that significantly impacts their life. This is as of 2010, according to the US Census Bureau. And you might be thinking 1 in 5, I'll represent that in a different way. In the United States alone, that's 56.7 million people have a disability of some kind or another. And this is even more, of course, around the globe. According to the World Health Organization in 2011, about 15% of the world's population has a significant disability, and that's about 785 million people worldwide. A lot of folks. Of these people in the United States, about 1 in 10 Americans, so about half of folks with a significant disability, have a disability that impacts their computer use directly. They might use any of those different assistive technologies we mentioned before. But here's the thing. Accessibility and designing your product or service in an accessible way helps everybody. All of those different categories of disability we talked about require different kinds of adaptations in the design of web content or their technology. But most of the time, those adaptations benefit everybody, not just people with disabilities. Here's a traditional example in Meet Space of a curb cut. We'll sometimes call this idea of designing something accessibly that helps everybody a curb cut effect. So in this image, we have what looks to be a curb up against a street. We can see a pedestrian walkway, and in the space going down to that walkway, the curb sort of indents. It makes a little ramp from the sidewalk down onto the road. It's called a curb cut here in the United States. And this, of course, helps folks with disabilities, so folks who might use a wheelchair, to get down from the curb onto the road. But this also helps people, for example, who might be pushing a cart of groceries, or someone pushing a stroller with a baby in it. This helps everybody be more mobile. It makes everybody's lives easier. Awesome. In the digital space, an example of the curb cut effect might be captions on a video. So these captions are necessary for deaf users, and they can be helpful to people who need to view a video without audio. Maybe you're in an office and you forgot your headphones and you don't want to bother your coworkers with audio. Or maybe you're on the bus and you left your headphones at home, but you still want to know what's going on. In this image here, I have a screen grab of YouTube. I think this is Jamie Lee Curtis talking about first aid kits. I don't know. But there are an example of some closed captions. And again, if you're watching this video, you should be seeing closed captions right now. They're helping everybody, not just folks with disabilities. Here's the other thing, though. Not only do these adaptations help everyone, it's important to remember that we are all just temporarily abled. Disease, injury, and age can all cause us to gain a disability of one kind or another. Unlike a lot of different kinds of marginalization that you might have, this is something that anybody could gain at any time for a variety of reasons. Okay, I think I've convinced you that this impacts a lot of people. It might even impact you, oh my gosh. So why do we make something accessible? There are several reasons, all of which are valid. They're just more or less altruistic than one another, let's say. So the first reason, to me the one that's most important, is to improve the lives of people with disabilities. I believe that we have an ethical duty to help all people who use what we're going to make. I believe that we are responsible for what we create. Regardless of what you make, if it's a website or a book or a painting, whatever you make, if you make something for another human being to interact with, you're responsible for making sure that those other humans can use that thing that you've made. Just that simple. Another reason why we build things accessibly is to capitalize on a wider audience or consumer base. So as I mentioned before, it's 700-something million people around the world have a disability. I really can't think of any ethical or economic argument that you could make for potentially excluding that many people from using your product. You wouldn't design a website to not work on 20% of browsers that your users use. So why would you design your website to not work for the 20% of Americans that have a disability, right? Here's that thing. Those 1 in 5 Americans in the United States alone control $175 billion in discretionary income. Now, we might debate whether it's the best idea to make something just to get money, but that's a lot of money. That's a billion with a B, right? You want a piece of that pie if you're making something as a way to get money. You want to receive part of this funding. Third reason for building something accessibly, it's the law. Hooray! You have to! Obligation! Woo, right? You might build something accessibly to avoid lawsuits or the bad press you get because you were sued. Hooray! So in the United States and around the world, there are a lot of laws that have been created as a part of the hard work of the disability rights movement. In the United States, the enforcement mechanism for these laws is usually lawsuits. Now, the threat of being sued can cause a business to decide to fix their accessibility problems. If some group identifies that your product has an accessibility issue and they threaten to sue you, that might be enough to make you go, whoa, never mind, we'll fix it. We are so sorry, please don't sue us. And also, if that's not enough for you, frequently the terms of a settlement for a lawsuit can require you to be accessible. Hooray! It's the law. I'm going to go over 2 major laws in the United States about accessibility and technology. There are, of course, a ton of different laws around the globe that vary in all sorts of different ways. I'm based in the US, this is what I know, but it should give you a basis for understanding for how things might work in your country if you're not from the US. So the first one is called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. You can see in the background here, there are some folks who are part of that disability rights movement fighting for the passage of this law in the 70s. This law prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in programs that are run by the federal government or that receive financial assistance from the federal government or in federal employment or in the employment practices of federal contractors. In 1998, Congress amended this act with something you may have heard of called Section 508, and that requires federal agencies to provide accessible electronic resources and information tech to people with disabilities. Now, you heard me say the word federal government a lot in that description, right? Currently, the Rehab Act doesn't require private websites that don't receive government funding, that have nothing to do with the government, to be accessible. Although this law is evolving as cases go on. But if you work for a company that does work for the federal government, or maybe the United States federal government itself, I'm sure you are very familiar with this law. The next, probably more familiar law to most folks about accessibility in the US is called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, folks will call it. This was passed in 1990. This is a labor law. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability, and it created accessibility requirements for public services and accommodations in the US. Here's the thing though, you see the year 1990, it's when it was passed. As a result, the ADA doesn't directly mention the web or the internet, right? But it works to ensure that people with disabilities have equal opportunities in all venues. Now, the Department of Justice was, at least, developing regulations that address web accessibility. Although there are several notable cases, we talked about lawsuits earlier, several notable cases regarding the ADA that have made it pretty clear that the ADA's authority pertains to websites, not just physical things. And it's clear that the ADA pertains to businesses that only exist online, that don't have a physical presence. And as I mentioned before, there are a lot of international laws. Okay, so this is all well and good. We understand that people have disabilities, they use assistive tech, and apparently I'm legally required to make my website accessible. Oh no! How do I know if what I'm making is accessible? This is a question I get a lot, even from folks who are motivated to build an accessible technology. They don't know where to start. The best starting place, the best advice I can give you to build something accessibly is to listen to people with disabilities. This both means involving people with disabilities in the creation of your technology. You should have folks on your team. You should represent a diverse worldview on your team, including folks with disabilities. You should also listen to the voices of people with disabilities who will use your technology. So this both means in user testing before you launch, as well as in the initial creation and design of what you're making. Involve people with disabilities. Also, I recommend that you follow best practices. So we talked about those laws. Some of them around the globe mention very specific requirements. There are also guidelines that can help you evaluate what you're creating. And there are a ton of different sets of guidelines and different resources you can use. I recommend picking the one that's best suited to what you're creating, and I'll go over two right now. The one that I will primarily discuss is the one that web developers use, but it's also a good framework for understanding regardless of what you're writing code for, not just the web. And it's called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's also called the WCAG or the WCAG. It's kind of hard to pronounce as an acronym. WCAG is what we go with. It's currently in version 2.0. So this was created by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. They are the governing body of the web. They're the folks that create guidelines like this that regulate how the internet, how the web should work. And this 2.0 iteration was published in December of 2008. So that's a bit before mobile web browsers were very common. That's a bit before touchscreens were very common. So keep that in mind when you read this. There is currently a working draft of the WCAG 2.1 out. It was released last month. If you're an accessibility nerd, you should read it. If you're not an accessibility nerd, you should read it. Just everybody read it. They're seeking public comment on their ideas, so tell them what you think about it. These guidelines are the basis for most web accessibility laws around the world, and some countries even directly include the WCAG in their laws as a requirement. In the WCAG, we have 4 principles that encompass a ton of guidelines for web accessibility. And under those, we have a lot of sub-guidelines and success criteria and detailed things like that. There are also 3 different conformance levels within the WCAG. Essentially, they are more or less strict than one another. And if you're trying to decide which conformance level to go with, I strongly encourage you to consult with a legal team that will tell you what's best for you. I'll get the question a lot of, Stephanie, which one do I want? Just pick one for me. And I'm happy to make a suggestion, but please do not take what I am saying as legal advice, okay? I'm not a lawyer, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about those 4 principles of the WCAG. And again, these are large principles with lots of guidelines underneath them. The first is perceivable. This requires your site be available to senses either through a browser or some form of assistive technology, which we discussed earlier. This information content and user interface components of the website have to be presentable to the users in a way that they can perceive. So this includes guidelines for things like captions, text alternatives for image or any non-text content, and different presentations of your content. It needs to be presented in multiple ways so different assistive tech can perceive it. Next is operable. This requires that your users can interact with all the different controls and interactive elements of your website, either using a mouse, a keyboard, or one of those assistive devices we mentioned. This includes guidelines for timing on your website. So if you have like a cart timer ticking down, this governs how that can be used. This also includes guidelines for navigation, keyboard navigation, and different techniques for preventing seizures that can be induced by flashing images or colors. Third is understandable. This requires that your content is clear and it limits confusion and ambiguity. It includes guidelines for helping users avoid making mistakes or coming back from a mistake when they make it. So things like error messages on a form both need to be clear, and it needs to be easy to fix the mistake. This also includes guidelines about making your text readable, both visually readable, as well as having the text be parsable and understandable. This also includes making your content operate in predictable ways. You can't do strange, unpredictable, surprising things with your users. A button that says open accordion needs to actually open an accordion and not do something else. Understandable. And the last is robust. This means that your site needs to work on a wide range of technologies, both different browsers, different kinds of assistive tech, different operating systems, and not just the newest, shiniest version of the OS or a browser. It needs to work also on like Internet Explorer 10. It needs to be accessible there too, right? This includes guidelines about having consistently parsable HTML. Essentially, you need to follow the rules of how HTML has to be constructed, and also having clear names, roles, values in your code. This is a lot more technical than some of the other guidelines can be, so I recommend reading it for yourself. Okay, so that's the WCAG. Hooray, you're all gonna go home and read the hundreds of pages of the WCAG. Yes, go you. The other important set of guidelines or framework that we talk about is the Open Accessibility Framework, or the OAF. Now, this is not so much about, but in general provides an outline of steps that have to be in place for any computing platform to be considered accessible. So this includes desktop and mobile operating systems. This includes web applications and mobile platforms. Now, the steps that are in this framework are analogous to those necessary to make a physical environment accessible. So by following these, you're also getting an idea of what, say, a civil engineer making a curb cut has to do to make their product accessible. There's 2 categories for these steps. The first one is creation. So the creation steps define the precursors and building blocks required for technology developers to create accessible applications and products. This includes defining what accessibility means for the intended use of your platform. What does accessibility even mean in this case? You also have to determine stock user interface elements and components so you can have cohesive and predictable meaning across the technology, and providing authoring tools that support accessibility. So if you, for example, are creating an operating system, if you are including authoring tools for people to make an application in your OS, those tools need to support accessibility also. The next section of steps in the OAF is use. So the use steps describe what's necessary in a computing environment in which those accessible applications will run. So this includes providing platform supports, providing accessible application software, and providing assistive technologies. So you might think about your desktop operating system. Not only could you download and install some assistive tech, but there are also things like text-to-screen readers or magnifiers built into the operating system, and that's because they followed some of the guidelines for the OAF. Okay, we've got two different sets of guidelines. We have some homework to go home and read these and know what they mean. You have homework, you have to understand this. But here's the thing, accessibility is more than just these guidelines. You could make a beautiful website and go through every step of the web content accessibility guidelines and still have built something that is inaccessible to some of your users. These guidelines are tools, they're not solutions. So as I mentioned before, the current version of the WCAG is from back in 2008. There's a lot of things it doesn't cover. It's a set of guidelines from a specific period of time. These guidelines help us determine if a page is inaccessible. So it's very easy to tell, oh, I failed such and such guideline within the WCAG. There might be accessibility issues for some of my users. But these guidelines can't tell us for certain if a page is accessible. How do we know if it's accessible? Why? We listen to people with disabilities. That's a callback, yes. It's important to listen to people with disabilities to determine if your technology is truly accessible. It's important to involve people with disabilities in the creation and use of your tech. Awesome, okay. So we care about accessibility, we have built something accessibly, we know how to check it, hooray! But you might be thinking, Stephanie, I'm a product manager, or Stephanie, I'm a designer. This is cool, but isn't this all something that a front-end engineer does? I don't have to worry about this. Not true. I say that everybody should be advocating for accessibility in whatever they're creating. And you need to help better advocate for people with disabilities in your work, whatever it is that you do. How do you do that? First, you collect baseline information. You look at your website or your app or whatever cool thing you've made, and you ask, am I accessible right now? You can either do an audit or hire some other lovely person to do an audit of your technology for you. There are also some really cool accessibility validator tools, both free and paid, where you can plop in like a URL for your website, and it'll highlight accessibility issues you might have, which is really helpful if you're just starting on your accessibility journey. With those, though, I will say be careful. They can only get about 40 to 60% of issues you might find. Part of that is because our technology is not yet perfect, right? But also because if you've constructed, say in a website, if you've constructed your HTML so strangely and so weirdly, this automated tool doesn't understand what you've done and can't tell you that you've done it wrong. For example, there are guidelines within the WCAG about headers and how they have to be constructed. Your heading tags have to go in order. You can't say skip one. You can't go heading level 1, heading level 3, heading level 4. There has to be a heading level 2 in there, right? And these validator tools will be so helpful if you've tagged everything as a heading tag, right? But if you just have a big blob of text, like a paragraph tag that you typed everything into, a validator tool might not realize that that's supposed to be a heading and that you've broken an accessibility rule. So be careful. I also have a human check this over. Okay, so you've gathered baseline information. What next? You can gather support at your organization. Identify stakeholders in your business and convince them of the business value of accessibility. And I can see some of you rolling your eyes because we know this is really hard. This is a hard problem, maybe harder than implementing accessibility on your site, is convincing the people who are in charge that accessibility is important. How do you do that? Well, one, you could link them to this video, obviously, right? No. You can talk about both you have an ethical duty to do this, and for some people that's enough, to point out that you have an ethical responsibility. Cool. You could also talk about financial incentives, getting some more money because you alienated part of your user base. You can talk about potential threats of lawsuits. You can give them awesome examples of companies who have been sued for being inaccessible. But really, the best argument I have found is to tell your stakeholders that it's cheaper to build your technology accessibly now than it is to go back and retrofit your website accessibly. I've had clients ask me before, well, the other people who built my website, if I had just had them do this right the first time, how much would it have been? And the answer is so much less money than it is to have me fix it now, right? It's also a lot cheaper than getting sued, most of the time. It's so much better to be proactively accessible, and that's a conversation that you should have with the stakeholders in your product. Next, you should define a standard. So define your internal standard for accessibility. That might be, oh, well, we want to follow the WCAG, we want conformance level AA, done. It might be more complicated than that, whatever is appropriate for your product. And then train people on this. And don't just train your front-end engineers. Maybe not everybody needs the details of how all the code works, but everybody involved in your product should understand what accessibility means at your company. Next and last, you need to monitor conformance for accessibility. I have definitely had clients before where they build a beautiful accessible website, and it's gorgeous and compliant, and oh, I love it. And then they'll give it off to their support devs, and they forget about the word accessibility entirely. It's important to be monitoring this as you go on. You can either do this by scheduling regular audits of your tech. You could also use an automated tool. There are several ones that are awesome that you can even tie into your gated pull requests and run a check to see, did this destroy accessibility in some way? If so, fix it, and then we'll merge the code. It's really cool. But you have to monitor your conformance for accessibility as your site or your technology exists. Okay, so with these steps, I think you have a better understanding of how you can advocate for accessibility. And you hopefully care about this, and I've convinced you that this is important. And I'll say to you that if you don't care about accessibility, then who will? If you're still on the fence, I need you to think, if I don't do this, if I don't care about people with disabilities, who is going to care about this? Now, maybe where you work, you have an entire internal team devoted to accessibility with QA and user experience and designers and front-end engineers, and it's this beautiful cross-functional team, and they meet every Wednesday, and they talk about accessibility. Cool. If you have that, that is awesome, and I want to know where you work, right? But most places do not have that. If you have anything short of a beautiful cross-functional team that meets regularly, you can do better than you're doing right now. You owe it to your users to do better. Start an initiative within your company or your open source project to care about accessibility. Or if there is an initiative already, join a small one. Even if you're not a person who code, you can still advocate for accessibility. The thing, I believe that you can do this. I know that sounds pithy. Hooray, you can do it, right? But here's the thing. People can be intimidated by accessibility. It seems tricky. There's so many guidelines to understand and all these complicated things, and I might get sued if I do it wrong, and it seems overwhelming, right? But accessibility is a solvable problem. It's something that, in my opinion, in the grand scheme of coding for a website, is relatively easy once you have support and time. You can make your site accessible. You can improve it. There are a ton of resources out there, and compared to those other problems in code, it's not that hard. And hopefully somewhat inspiring to you, the image on this slide is folks that are a part of the disability rights movement. I believe this was protests around in support of the ADA. They're carrying a banner. These folks are in wheelchairs, carrying a banner that says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," which is a quote attributed to MLK. You can do this. It is important to your users. It is important because you owe this to them. As I said before, we are all responsible for improving the lives of people who use our technology, and accessibility is one of the ways we can achieve that. And I hope that by sitting through this talk, you understand that accessibility is more than just screen readers. Thank you.